This lecture will focus on Proverbs chapter 1, verses 10 through 19, the appeal of wealth. First, let's consider how this particular poem operates within its surrounding context. After the prologue, that is, verses 1 through 9 of chapter 1, with its aims, literary tools, and two supreme examples of wisdom teaching, now we come to a place where the sage is presenting what can be considered a wisdom commendation. Now, by wisdom commendation is meant a wisdom composition that makes a case for the worth of wisdom in general, in contrast to what we could call wisdom content, where we expect to find actual nuggets of wisdom that are applicable to specific situations in life. Wisdom commendations will recur through wisdom compositions. Generally, they are brief, filling only one or two verses, paving the way for a more extensive wisdom content that then immediately follows the commendation. If you'd like to see an example of this more typical usage of a wisdom commendation, take a look at chapter 3 in Proverbs. There's a poem that spans verses 1 through 12. The first two verses of those 12 supply a wisdom commendation. It serves to introduce the wisdom content that we'll pick up in verse 3 and extend through verse 12. In contrast, here in chapter 1, at the early edges of the entire book, the sage felt it necessary to make a somewhat grander case for wisdom's worth. So we find here in chapter 1, verses 10 through 19, an extensive wisdom commendation. This initial wisdom commendation consists of three distinct parts. This initial wisdom commendation actually extends beyond verse 19 of chapter 1. That is simply part 1 of the commendation. Part 2 we'll pick up in chapter 1, verse 20, extend through the end of that chapter. That also serves as a wisdom commendation. And finally, in chapter 2, the entire chapter is one poem, and it also is a wisdom commendation. So there's a three-part wisdom commendation picking up in 1:10, going to the end of chapter 2. Actual wisdom content then starts to unroll in chapter 3. Let's read through Proverbs 1:10 through 19. Once again, I'll be following the translation that I have developed, as you see on the screen before you. My son, if sinners try to persuade you, do not go. If they say, come with us, let's lie in wait for blood, let's lurk unprovoked for the innocent. We will swallow them alive like Sheol and whole as the pit descenders. All sorts of precious wealth will we find, and our houses will be filled with booty. Cast your lot with us. There will be a single bag for us all. My son, do not walk along the way with them. Withdraw your foot from their path, for their feet run to evil and hurry to shed blood. Surely it's pointless to spread the net in the sight of any flight master. But they, for their own blood do they lie in wait. They lurk for their own lives. Such are the ways of every ruthless profiteer. The life of its master shall it take. After introducing the purpose of the book, that was the first 9 verses of Proverbs 1, now the balance of this first chapter divides into two competing appeals confronting the youth. It's helpful to appreciate that these two parts balance each other. First is this current poem, the appeal of wealth, verses 10 to 19. Then it will be followed by the appeal of wisdom, verses 20 to 33. The current poem, the appeal of wealth, subdivides itself into two primary segments: recruitment overtures that are issued by a gang of thieves, as reported by the parent or sage in verses 11 to 14, followed by that same parent or sage exposing the gang's self-destructive outcomes, and that occupies verses 15 through 18. The only verses remaining then are the introduction in verse 10 and a conclusion in verse 19. These two artfully encase the appeal of wealth. There are two structures that operate on what we could call the macro level, and we'll be using that term to describe any linkages or literary structures that are not confined just to one section, but move out and connect with another section. Incidentally, by sections, we are designating the first level of subdivision within a poem. So, as we look at Proverbs 1, 10 to 19, you can see 3 Roman numerals in the outline. Roman numeral 1 is section 1, verse 10. Roman numeral 2 designates section 2, 11 through 19. And Roman numeral 3, section 3, the conclusion. Once again, then, just so we can keep terminology straight, we want to begin exploring structure by looking at the largest structures, those which span the largest pieces or portions of a poem. Macrostructures we'll use by definition to designate those structures that are operating from one section, that is the highest subdivision, to another section. In contrast, as you might predict, we'll class the remainder as microstructures. Those then by default will be any structures or linkages which will be confined to operating within a single section. All right, so we have 2 macro structural features that operate in Proverbs 1, 10 to 19. One is a dual theme introduction, and the second is closure. Let's look at dual theme introduction first. As you can see in the outline, the dual theme introduction then operates in verse 10. It creates macro level connections with section 2, and it does so in 2 ways. First, the dual theme introduction anticipates the content of both parts of section 2. As you look at section 2, you can see it subdivides into 2 blocks, block A and B. Thus, the notion of sinners trying to persuade, and here we're drawing from the dual theme introduction, verse 10, part A. My son, if sinners try to persuade you. This notion of sinners trying to persuade anticipates the theme that we later encounter, a theme of enticement, and it shows up in block 2A. Incidentally, when we label a section or a portion 2A, that means that this block occurs in section 2, and it is block A within that. It is the first block of that. So block 2A governs the verses 11 through 14, and you see the title in the outline, Gang's Enticement. Once again, to summarize, from section 1, that is verse 10, the first hemistich, the first half, if sinners try to persuade you, then connects with, it anticipates what will be expanded in verses 11 to 14, which is labeled as block 2A. Next, the notion of caution that we find in the second half of verse 10, and here we're referring to this expression, do not go. This in turn anticipates the theme of warning that shows up in the next part of section 2, block 2B, and that spans verses 15 to 18. This is what we have in mind by a dual theme introduction operating in verse 10, and you can see that it moves beyond that section, which is admittedly a very small section. Section 1 is only 1 verse long, and then it cascades down into section 2, block A and B. There's a second dimension to this dual theme introduction. It has to do with the condition statement that we find in verse 10. If sinners persuade you, the last half of it, the apodosis implies the word then, although it's not used in Hebrew and not needed in English. That's a conditional statement. That structure of enticement plus a consequent warning In this way, the introduction explicitly mirrors the structure of 11 through 18. So as a protasis, that is the first half of a conditional statement, the if portion, appears in 10a. We also have a protasis that dominates 11 through 14. Notice verse 11, it begins, if they say. And just as an apodosis, that is the then portion of a conditional statement, the second half, shows up in 10b, we have another more extended apodosis that dominates verses 15 to 18. I trust you're gathering from this sort of close scrutiny that the craftsmanship is very sophisticated operating within this poem. So there are two dimensions of macrostructural connection that operate in the dual theme introduction. Let's see what's going on in terms of closure. And now we need to turn our attention to section 3, which is comprised solely of verse 19. The saying comprising section 3, that is verse 19, presents a maximal degree of closure for the poem. This is achieved by recycling terms or concepts encountered earlier in the poem. In fact, the only element not expressed or implied earlier is the initial summative expression, that is, such are, that we find opening verse 19. Such are the ways of every ruthless profiteer. Every other word in verse 19 has already occurred in previous material, that is, beginning with verse 1 and cascading through verse 18. The scholar Barbara Smith made this statement concerning closure. The conditions for maximal closure will arise when the structural principles in a poem predetermine its conclusion most rigorously, and when the greatest number of concentration of certain features appear in its terminal lines. It's as if to say, walking through this poem from 10 to 18, we could pretty well predict what 19 ought to say. And if that's the case, if we read 19 and say, oh, yes, all of that comes to a focus in verse 19, all the previous poem, that shows that the composer, that the author has achieved what Barbara Smith calls maximal closure, another sign of sophisticated composition. And please keep in mind, when we note sophistication of composition, our interest is not simply to admire a high level of artistry, but to harvest from those structures the persuasive, the rhetorical, the message-bearing impact which those sophisticated structures convey to us. In the case of verse 19, having maximal closure, it's rather like an American baseball game where you have the bases loaded and somebody hits a home run, a grand slam at the end. They bring it all together at the end. That's the rhetorical punch that's delivered by maximal closure. The Hebrew poets, the sages, understood that, and they used that feature with great effectiveness. In the next portion of this lecture, we'll turn our attention to microstructures.